Hey y'all, welcome to the channel. Today we're checking out the Stone Roses, the volatile rise and fall of the band.
The Stone Roses were a British band who could have had a massive career, but destiny had other plans. Their story is one of silence that simply dragged on for too long and killed the group's momentum. Hailing from Manchester, England, there was an air of excitement around the band in the late 80s and early 90s. It almost felt like a revolution was going to happen with the group, and they would come to influence many of the bands who made up the Britpop movement years later in the mid-90s. Today, let's explore whatever happened to the Stone Roses.
Awesome. Cool. Yeah, so I just learned about the Stone Roses maybe a couple of months ago. I reacted to a video showing something like the top 10 bands that never made it in America. They were big in Britain, but they just couldn't get a career going in America. And the Stone Roses was one of them. And I was surprised I never heard of them because they were so huge in the UK. And I liked some of their music. Anyway, I'm interested to learn more about these guys.
Seattle is probably the first city that comes to mind when you think of urban centers associated with music. It was common practice for club promoters to use the line "from Seattle" when promoting bands in the early 90s.
I think of Nashville, Memphis, Chicago, New York, before Seattle.
In the early 90s. This type of marketing wasn't just limited to the Pacific Northwest, as years earlier, the UK city of Manchester was producing some pretty exciting music. The Stone Roses guitarist John Squire would admit to Rolling Stone, "The Manchester scene is a convenient myth to sell product, whether it be records or newspapers." Manchester was known for producing groups like Joy Division and the Smiths, and their bleak music can probably be attributed in part to the gloomy weather and dire political climate.
What other bands are from Manchester? I do feel like I hear that like a band is from Manchester quite a lot. I think Oasis was, right? The Smiths, Joy Division, The Fall, Oasis, New Order, Doves, The Stone Roses, Buzzcocks, The Hollies. Wow, there's a lot. Elbow. I've heard of them. Simply Red, The Ting Tings, Bee Gees. What? Whoa. Manchester. And he said it's because of the bad weather and crazy politics, is what he said? That would make some good music. The bad weather because you'd be inside all the time, and the politics would give you something to sing about. It makes sense.
The gloomy weather and dire political climate. But by the late 80s, it would be rave clubs in Manchester, including the Hacienda, that created the fertile grounds for groups like the Stone Roses and Happy Mondays to emerge. Punk rock in the 70s gave a voice to those who felt disenfranchised with the political system in the country. There was a sense of taking back control. A decade later, a different generation faced the same problems, but instead of anger, they decided to focus their energy into having a good time. By the late 80s, people all over the country descended on the Hacienda to party and in some cases take drugs.
And in some cases, take drugs. I bet in a lot of cases, take drugs. That sounds like a late 80s thing. 80s in general. People just wanted to have a good time, it seems like. It was a big party decade, right?
Their problems. Tony Wilson, who was called the Donald Trump and the Brian Epstein of the Manchester music scene, would tell the LA Times about why the city's music scene was so exciting, revealing the revolutionary thing about what is happening in Manchester is that it is the first blue-collar revolution in pop since Elvis in 1956. The Beatles, the Rolling Stones, the Sex Pistols were very middle-class, art college. The old joke is that the Beatles' mommies gave them their first guitars.
That's interesting, because I think, I mean, John Lennon's and Paul McCartney's moms both died when they were both really young, but their parents supported their musical endeavors, I think. And John Lennon did go to art college, I think.
Gave them their first guitars. Much like Seattle during the grunge years, record companies and journalists around the world, including Rolling Stone and MTV, soon descended on Manchester, which was dubbed Madchester. The Manchester movement would blend together styles of acid music, psychedelia, and 60s pop. And soon enough, the energy of the Manchester movement spread to other parts of Europe, where British rock and dance fans followed acts from the city as they visited major hubs including Paris and Amsterdam. The Stone Roses' history began with frontman Ian Brown and guitarist John Squire, who grew up on the same street in South Manchester. They came from lower middle-class families and met at the age of 4. But they wouldn't really be close until after school when they bonded over their love of punk rock, including groups like The Clash and the Sex Pistols. Squire would be inspired to pick up guitar at the age of 14 after hearing the Sex Pistols for the first time. For frontman Ian Brown, it would be a chance meeting with singer Gino Washington in Manchester.
Gino Washington. Who's Geno Washington? He's from Evansville, Indiana. He sort of came up in the London music scene because he was stationed there for the military. Washington is a member of the Guild of Hypnotists. What if he hypnotized Ian Brown? Okay, Geno Washington.
Washington that night was enthralled with Brown's charisma and said that he should go into the music business. By 1983, the Stone Roses would be formed, and the band's name would be thought up by the group's guitarist, being inspired by having two words that were in sharp contrast to each other. The original lineup of the Stone Roses was made up of vocalist Ian Brown, guitarist John Squire, bassist Pete Garner, and drummer Simon Wollstonecroft. The band rehearsed for 6 months and wouldn't play their first gig until late 1984, opening for The Who's Pete Townsend.
So they started a band, rehearsed for 6 months, which isn't that long, and their first gig was opening up for Pete Townsend? That's a huge first gig, right? How did they get that? How does that work?
Opening for The Who's Pete Townsend at an anti-drug event in London.
Well, he did say it was an anti-drug event, so maybe they couldn't get anybody else to play it because they were all pro-drug.
By 1985, Wollstonecroft would leave the group and be replaced by drummer Rennie. And the same year, the group released their first singles, So Young and Tell Me, and it did little to make much of a mark. By this point in time, the Stone Roses hadn't really zeroed in on
So Young and Tell Me. I wonder how many copies they sold. Oh, this says they sold 93 copies? That's not very good. Ian Brown has since distanced himself from the song, saying he wouldn't pay 10p for it now, and that it sounded like four lads trying to get out of Manchester. How many copies did they sell? I can't verify that they only sold 93 copies, but that's what the one source said.
By this point in time, the Stone Roses hadn't really zeroed in on their distinct sound. In an attempt to get the band's name out there in Manchester, Brown and Rennie went on a graffiti-tagging campaign around the city, but it did little to win over fans.
Graffiti?
They soon turned their attention to getting a new manager to market the group.
So they went around town and tagged stuff, like did graffiti around Manchester. I want to see their tags. It's probably been painted over. Okay, they would paint their name, the Stone Roses, over bridges and walls all over Manchester. It was sprayed in black every 50 yards on the road between Didsbury and Manchester City Centre. Rumor had it lead singer Ian Brown and Remy were responsible. They were. It could have been a coincidence, or the roadies, or the band who did it, says Rob. It got them local notoriety. The music industry inner circle thought they were hooligans, but it started people talking about them, and that's one thing you want as a band. And the Roses broke through in the end. So this video says it didn't help them, but it looks like maybe it did.
But it did little to win over fans. They soon turned their attention to getting a new manager to market the group and open up business opportunities. They would enlist manager Gareth Evans, who owned a local rehearsal space, and Evans would get the job by dropping his pants and trying to sell his underwear to the band. It was his way of showing his persuasiveness. It would be a move that would pay off, but it would also have dire consequences for the band's career, something we'll talk more about in the video.
So this manager is trying to convince the band to hire him as their manager, so he pulls his pants down and tries to sell his underwear to them. And it worked. It's kind of rock and roll, I guess. It does show his ambition and a lot of other things.
One of Evans' first orders of business was to sign a deal with indie label FM Revolver to put one single out, which would end up being the group's much-loved song Sally Cinnamon. Sally Cinnamon showed a new sound and style of the band, focusing a lot more on melody. The same year, the band would undergo another lineup change, with bassist Pete Garner leaving the group and being replaced by Manny. Manny would be the missing piece the band was looking for, and Brown recalled the impact of Manny joining the group, recalling, "When Manny joined, it almost changed overnight. It became a totally different groove. Straight away, everything just fell into place," he'd say. The following year in 1988...
I'm so curious to hear the style difference. Sally Cinnamon. I gotta hear it. Okay, so I listened to that song, and I could see it's pretty poppy. I see what he means, that they're focusing more on melody.
The following year in 1988, the band played at Dingwalls in London, a show that had members of several record labels in attendance, including Zomba and Rough Trade Records. The Stone Roses would end up signing an astounding 8-album deal with Zomba-owned subsidiary Silvertone Records.
8 albums?
Silvertone would put up the money for the group to record the 1988 single Elephant Stone, with New Order's Peter Hook producing.
Yo, an 8 album deal. That's like scary. I would recommend 3 album deal at the most. Because once you get past that 5th or 6th album, things are different. Oh, things are different. Things change. Executives at the labels change. They like go between the record labels. It just switches all around too much. 8 albums. To do an album a year would be really quick these days. Like really quick. Especially back, yeah, in the 80s too. An album a year, that would be kind of too much overexposure, and then each album would be cannibalizing the album before. So you want to do like 2 or 3 years between each album. An 8 album deal? That's like 20 years or something. No, 24 years, right? Yeah, don't sign an 8 album deal.
Silvertone would put up the money for the group to record the 1988 single Elephant Stone, with New Order's Peter Hook producing. The single helped raise the band's profile in Manchester, but it did little to get their name across the country.
Well, I gotta listen to that. Pardon me one moment. Wow, very different sound. Very rhythmic, syncopated.
While Hook was expected to produce their first full-length record, he would be unavailable due to other commitments, so John Leckie would come on board, and ahead of working on their first full-length album, Leckie would help produce their breakthrough single, Made of Stone. Made of Stone would make NME's Single of the Week and show up in the UK's top 40 charts. The song owed part of its success to a radio DJ named Richard Skinner, who played the song on his late-night radio show, helping propel its reach. It was this song that got the band on the radar of a lot of people outside of Manchester.
Back when radio meant something.
The group's self-titled record would be recorded across several studios in the UK and Wales, and some of the songs off their debut album, including Waterfall and I Wanna Be Adored, dated as far back as 1985. The album's famous cover was painted by guitarist John Squire, who called his work Bye Bye Bad Man, which is the name of a song on the album. The lemons on the cover art were inspired by a documentary that Squire and Brown had watched about the student riots in Paris in 1968. The students used to suck on lemons to deal with the effects of tear gas that police were using against protesters.
Cool.
While their peers were fine emulating other bands, the Stone Roses had more ambitious plans. They also weren't afraid to be political. Songs such as Bye Bye Bad Man and Elizabeth My Dear are clear examples of this. The Stone Roses would take 7 months to record their debut album, a record that would define them for the rest of their career.
7 months is a long time to record an album. I bet they were probably recording a little bit, then playing shows, then recording a little bit, that kind of thing. Wow, it sounds way better. So I just listened to some of their first album, and the production of it compared to the singles that they put out before then is so different. It sounds so much better. Good work, boys.
A record that would define them for the rest of their career. Of course, at the time they had no idea that they were on the verge of making history, as the members were pretty poor. Bassist Manny almost missed the first studio session after not having enough money for a cab, but Leckie would bail him out. The producer would tell Enemy magazine about the band's attitude in the studio, saying they weren't frightened. They didn't seem to feel any pressure other than that they were a band making their first album, and they didn't want to lose the opportunity to make it good. So there wasn't any pressure to prove themselves. They knew they were good, he'd say. The release of the Stone Roses' self-titled debut album created so much buzz that there was a genuine feeling in the press and amongst fans that this band was going to be the next big thing. The band's debut appearance on Top of the Pops in November of 1989 only helped propel their nationwide exposure. But not all of their TV appearances went well, as during an appearance the same month on BBC's The Late Show, almost a minute into the band's performance, their power was cut. Rather than giving the band another chance, the program host tried to go to the next segment, and while most bands would have been grateful for the opportunity to be on television, frontman Ian Brown can be seen in the background slamming the show, as you can see here.
Work and for creating a new school of British documentary photography. We'll do it. We'll sort it out in a minute. Critics allege he's exploiting his subjects rather than making social commentary. He has already agreed to take 2 of the photographs.
This appearance only helped raise...
I'm torn on that. Because you want to be professional, and it doesn't seem like the power was cut intentionally. was an accident. Poor, what do you call it, electronics guy. But, he was in the middle of this performance, and then it's like he's from Manchester. But I think his attitude, like kind of combative attitude, probably made him seem like more of a rock star. So I could see how it would help him, actually.
This appearance only helped raise the band's profile, and soon enough hysteria spread across Europe, and the band was playing venues across the continent. Their debut album would end up going on to sell 4 million copies worldwide.
That's
The
great.
Stone Roses' old label, FM Revolver, hoping to capitalize on the group's success, would reissue their single Sally Cinnamon along with an accompanying music video without the band's permission. The band didn't take the move lightly, so in January of 1990, they showed up outside of their old record label, FM Revolver's offices, on their way to the recording studio in Wolverhampton. The head of FM Revolver, Simon Birch, would recall to the Birmingham Mail newspaper, "There was a knock at the door and my wife came up to my office and said, 'The Stone Roses are here to see you.' I didn't take it seriously at first, and after about 10 minutes, she came back and said, 'The Stone Roses are still waiting downstairs to see you.' I came to the front door and then all hell broke loose. They had members of their management team with them as well, and they just barged in and there was paint flying everywhere. It was absolute mayhem," he'd remember. The members of the band and their management team would splatter paint all over Birch, his wife, as well as their office hallways, and several of Birch's cars in the parking lot, as their way of exacting revenge. It was estimated that the band caused about £27,000 worth of damage, with Manny later recalling in Mojo magazine, "The paint business had to happen, because this cheeky bugger kept putting this shit record out. We warned him, but that's the way people deal with things in Manchester."
Okay. Yeah. See? Okay. They signed an 8-album deal with that guy. And the guy's making videos without their permission. It's probably in this contract that he can do that. And they probably didn't see that in the contract. And now they're in his office throwing paint at stuff. You don't want to be doing that to someone who owns you for 8 albums. How do you come back from that? How do you establish a relationship with this guy? But I do have to say, that's pretty fucking rock star.
We warned him, but that's the way people deal with things in Manchester. As this incident shows, the band wasn't afraid to get themselves in trouble or give up opportunities of a lifetime. The band once turned down an offer to open for the Rolling Stones, while another incident saw the Stone Roses play a charity concert with James as the headliner. The members of the Stone Roses would end up printing posters with their names at the top of the bill. Then they would go on late and played so long that James's time was cut. In the audience of that charity show were brothers Liam and Noel Gallagher, with Noel recalling to The Independent, "We were into the Jam and the Smiths before that. We thought you had to go to college or be an art student to be in a band. When I went to see the Roses, they looked exactly the same as we did. When I heard Sally Cinnamon for the first time, I knew what my destiny was," he'd say.
So they were playing a charity event. It's a charity event. They opened for a band called James, but they printed flyers that showed them as the headliner. And then when they opened for James, they played over their time so that the band James's time was cut. I can see now how this influenced the guys in Oasis and their kind of behavior. Pretty hilarious, though. Pretty hilarious. Wow.
One of the band's most celebrated gigs was their performance in 1990 at Spike Island to more than 28,000 fans. Spike Island was a strange choice for a gig given that British rock royalty, including the Stones and Pink Floyd, had opted to play Nebworth instead. But in the attitude of doing things their own way, they opted to play an abandoned chemical waste site. It wasn't just the group's music that was celebrated, as the Stone Roses soon became fashion icons, with kids copying their style of wearing baggy clothing and Rennie hats.
What's a Rennie hat? Oh. Those are back in style, I think, aren't they? I see people wearing those all the time.
There was a lot of anticipation for the group's second album. The band's sessions for their follow-up record actually dated back to 1990, but they didn't have a lot to show for it. When producer John Leckie showed up to the studio during those early sessions, the band only had 2 songs, neither of which impressed him. The band would spend another several months during the same year, only coming up with a double-sided single with the songs One Love and Something's Burning. Fans wouldn't hear any new material from the Roses for another 4 years, and the single for its part would peak at number 4, but the band at that point in time had already peaked. Just as the Stone Roses' career was fading away in the early 90s, the scene in Manchester also took a turn for the worst, with Brown recalling to Spin magazine, "There was a feeling of strength coming out of a club at the end of the night, feeling like you were going to change the world. Then the guns came in and heroin starts being put in the X. It took a lot of love vibe out, he'd say. The recording contract that the group signed with Silvertone was so lopsided in favor of the label that their manager Gareth Evans thought it would be easy to walk away from. Following the group's legendary gig at Spike Island, their manager tried to get out of the contract with Silvertone, but the label successfully lobbied to get an injunction against the band in March of 1991 to prevent them from recording any new music for 1 full year. Frontman Ian Brown would tell Melody Maker, "Silvertone have got us for 35 years. We'd only gotten 10 for armed robbery," he'd remark.
Wow. Wow. I underestimated at 24 years. 35 years. 35 years. Ugh. Wow. And at this point in the story, they've done 1 album so far, and they're struggling for content for their second album. I think he said in there that it took 4 years for their next album to come out. These poor guys. Don't sign an 8-album deal.
"Silvertone have got us for 35 years. We'd only gotten 10 for armed robbery," he'd remark. The label, for their part, claimed they just wanted the Roses to put out another album, but the band's lawyer would claim the Stone Roses signed, and I quote, "undoubtedly one of the worst contracts I'd ever seen." Brown would add, "It was only when we became successful in their terms that they wanted to sort out a decent contract. We were angry with the company because we considered them to be slow. They could not understand our potential," he would say. It was during this time that the Stone Roses also started to have some dialogue with American label Geffen Records, who most famously had Nirvana, Aerosmith, and Guns N' Roses on their roster at the time. The label was so enthralled with the British act that they offered to cover the band's legal expenses if it meant that they could sign the band.
Wow.
Guitarist John Squire would recall in 1993 his thinking at the time, saying, "I remember looking at the very real prospect of never making another record and just doing gigs. We all agreed that if we couldn't get out of the deal, we were prepared to take it that far." Meanwhile, their lawyer John Kennedy would sum up the real situation if the band was unsuccessful in their bid, saying the worst case scenario was that if they didn't win, they'd be forced to work with Zomba again. That's a bit like a divorce court telling a couple they have to go back and live together again.
Yeah.
Luckily for the Stone Roses, by May of 1991, the court would rule in favor of the group, and they would be allowed to get out of their contract with Silvertone. The band would sign with Geffen Records, earning $1 million advance.
They got so lucky, y'all. That does not happen. So, they have this crap deal for 8 albums, 35 years. Geffen says, we'll buy you out. We'll buy you out of that contract, pay your legal fees, and sign you, and we'll give you $1 million to put in your pocket right now. Oh, so lucky. So lucky.
But from the beginning, they were not wise with their money, with Manny recalling to Mojo magazine. "We all went to the south of France and hired a helicopter and stayed in a $500 a night hotel for a few weeks. We went, right, let's F off and spend some money." The court case with Silvertone would also result in another major change for the band. It had come out in the court case that their old label had actually made overtures to try and smooth things over with the members of Stone Roses, offering them a $100,000 US Christmas bonus. But their manager Gareth Evans would end up pocketing most of the money, with only a few $1,000s making it to the members. Shortly after the court case, the band dumped their manager. The Stone Roses would hit the studio sporadically.
Okay, so I think that's the same manager who pulled his pants down and tried to sell them his underwear. He was pocketing the money. That happens a lot, y'all. And it doesn't matter how big of an artist they are, they're not immune to these things. The music industry is packed with vampires. They're everywhere. The entertainment industry in general, but the music industry more so, because it's smaller and there's less regulation. There's no unions, really. It's a shady place.
The Stone Roses would hit the studio sporadically in 1992 and 1993, but the band's chemistry was drying up. The members were also butting heads over musical direction and ideas. Producer John Leckie would recall to Mojo, "That period was a disaster. By the time we got to the studio, it would be 10 or 11 o'clock at night. There were always problems, power cuts, electrical things, people disappearing."
Oh.
And soon enough, Leckie was off the project and more producers came and went. Meanwhile, the band was racking up hundreds of thousands of dollars in studio time, and by 1994, Geffen's big investments, Nirvana and Guns N' Roses, were virtually finished. Now the label, who had previously neglected the band, was pressuring them to wrap up work on their second album. Titled Second Coming, the record would finally arrive 5.5 years after their debut record. It was met with lukewarm reviews, as fans were shocked at the change in the band's sound, going for more of a bluesier feel. The album would
Really?
end up selling a total of 1 million copies worldwide, significantly underperforming against the label's expectations.
1 million records is not that bad. I want to hear, Second Coming. So they say it's bluesier. Okay. Very interesting, y'all. I just listened to some of Second Coming, and I see what they mean by it being more bluesy. It came out in 95, I guess? I feel like I know in the States, the music from 1990 to 1995 that was popular in rock was very different. In 1990, 1991, 1990, I guess, it was still kind of pretty much the same as 88 or 89, like the late 80s. A lot of reverbs and that kind of thing. But in like 92, 93, the more raw organic sound became in vogue. So there'd be less reverb, very raw sounding, earthy sounding recordings. I think they just took too long to come out with their second album, and the trend passed them by. That's a shame. Too bad, guys.
By the mid 90s, members slowly left the group and the band finally broke up in 1996. It was during their hiatus that the members pursued other musical projects. In the years that followed, it seemed unlikely that the Stone Roses would ever reunite, with some of the members swearing off a reunion in the press. By 2011, the band would finally reunite, and there were rumors that there was new music on the way. The Stone Roses would play concerts up until 2017 and release a few singles, but a proper follow-up album to Second Coming never materialized. The group would
Wow.
finally call it quits in 2017. That does it for today's video, guys. Thanks for watching. Be sure to like button.
So I guess they kept playing shows here and there after their second album up through 2017. Well, John Squire, the guitar player, did say he could see a time when he was just playing shows and not making albums. I love the shenanigans that they got up to. I wish I knew more to the story, like what instigated them to do those things. Like on the TV broadcast, when the power went out, I guess they thought the power was cut intentionally. And then when they played that show, they opened for James at that charity event. They made flyers saying they were the headliners, and then they played first and went over their time. Crazy. You know, the music of Oasis has always hit me as very derivative of other bands, but now their behavior in public also seems derivative of the Stone Roses. Fascinating story, kind of a tragedy, so much potential. Anyway, this was a really interesting video. Thank you all for watching this with me, and I'll see you next time. Later.